want to get to know Dr. Brooks. He's a new professor. This is his first semester here. He formerly taught at RTS Charlotte. He teaches introductory and specialized counseling courses covering theological method, history, the evaluation of psychological theories, as well as the supervision of students through their practicums. He also serves as the counseling minister at Faith Baptist in Youngsville. He's the founder and director of Courage Christian Counseling, a small practice that specializes in providing virtual counseling for survivors and perpetrators of abuse and trauma. So he's into the theory and he's into the practice, which is just excellent. He lives here with his wife, Kate, and together they have 3 children. Now, at our last library talk, Dr. Quinn did a speed round with Gavin Ortland, and I'm just poaching that idea from him. That's genius. Nate is primed for a speed round, so you know how these things work. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask this question. You basically have like 5 to 10 seconds to answer, and you can't elaborate on your answer. So that's like purgatory for a professor. I mean, come on. Exactly. So we'll see. Sometimes professors are really bad at this. We'll see. I don't think you will be. I think you'll be great at the speed round. So let's just get to know you a little bit and start with your favorite food. Pass. Does that mean you don't like food, or? No. Let's see. Favorite food. Anything that doesn't have gluten in it. Anything that doesn't have gluten. Okay, great. You're from Southern California, so mountains or beach? Oh, both? I thought you'd say that. Yeah. Favorite book of the Bible? Probably Psalms. I thought I could go to Psalms. Yeah. Yeah. I might have been a little disappointed if you didn't. I mean, I could have said Obadiah. But yeah. How often do you use Obadiah versus Psalms in your counseling? Rarely. Okay. Yeah. Okay, this is a good one. Favorite movie? Oh, man. Probably Fiddler on the Roof. Oh, nice. Tradition. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great movie. Sweet or salty? Salty. Good choice. Every single time. Good choice. Okay, you can elaborate briefly on this, but your favorite hobby? Favorite hobby? Endurance running. Okay. So, yeah, I really enjoy running. I'm on pace to crack 1,000 miles this year. Okay. Which is a little bit less than I wanted it to be because we did this thing called moving. Yeah. And that put a dent in it. But yeah. It's a lot more miles than I've run this year. Yeah. So I realize that's super weird, right? Like there's nothing morally superior about it. But I really enjoy it. Yeah. So that's great. Yeah. That's great. As I drive around the Triangle, I observe there are many like you in the area. Mm-hmm. Okay, what in your opinion, what's the best genre of music, or what's your favorite genre of music? Let's see. I really like the Bon Iver kind of indie folk style, which fits being a counselor who loves introspective emotions and things like that, right? Okay. Good. Yeah. Good. I'm not as much of as a Swiftie as Dr. Kellen over here, but you know. Okay. Not everybody can be perfect. Morning or evening? Oh, morning. Okay. Unlike my wife. Okay. How about this? And this you can interpret recent how you like, but recently completed bucket list items. Oh, recently completed bucket list items. Doing a library talk with my friend Rob Coleman. Yeah, okay. Love that. Yeah. Not getting fired at the trustee meeting yesterday. Yeah, that's bucket list. That's bucket list. Amen. And finally, what are you most looking forward to before the end of this year? Let's see. We have my wife's family coming out from California for Christmas, and it's been a while since we've seen them, and they haven't actually been up here yet. So looking forward to showing them kind of the new area that we live in, and our kids love them to pieces. Good. So wonderful. Looking forward to that. Wonderful. Well, Nate, thanks again for doing this. Nate and I go way back doing theological education together in South America. We've been friends for a long time, so yeah, we're just really happy you're here. Really happy to talk about this this topic of emotionally healthy spirituality. So this first question is actually a number of questions in one. And so I'm just going to read kind of each of these questions to prime our minds for the talk, and then to let you kind of answer them as you wish. Okay. So first will be, what is emotionally healthy spirituality, and how is it relevant for our community here? As you answer this question, I want to make the audience aware of the subtitle of Scazzero's book, and is this: it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. So can you assess that statement? Is it true? Does Scripture encourage us to pursue emotional health? Just get us started with this topic.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when we start, we want to recognize that the word emotions is a really broad word. Actually, it's kind of a word that's cannibalized a lot of other words. So when you look historically, there have been words such as passions. Some of our older theological writers will describe animal spirits, which is about my favorite term to ever be used in theological literature and things like that. We used to have a much kind of richer tapestry of words that we use to describe what we kind of now all roll into our emotions, right? You even think of, we tend to think of our desires as emotions, our loves as emotions, our dislikes as emotions, our processing of things as being emotional in many ways. And so I think as we talk about this term, we need to recognize that it's actually a really broad term that incorporates a lot of who God has designed us to be. So actually, as part of my dissertation, which if any of you guys struggle with insomnia, I can send you my dissertation and it will cure it immediately. But I went through something like 4,000 pages of Reformed confessional statements and was looking at how do they describe us as human beings. And all of them that talk about how human beings process the world use three categories. They talk about us as cognitive beings. We're thinking, rational beings. We are volitional beings who make choices and have a will. And we're emotional beings that love and desire things. And that category is equally as important to our healthy spirituality as would be cognition, as would be our choices. So when we even think about the greatest commands in the Bible, it's love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Is that the Bible actually frames this emotional capacity, our passions, our desires, as being the word that God chose to pick. He could have said, think rightly about the Lord your God. He could have said, do rightly by the Lord your God, but he didn't. Instead, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so even baked into the greatest commandment in the Bible, we have this emotional aspect of who we are. And so if we want to talk about emotionally healthy spirituality, we need to understand that even the cornerstone of our spirituality, namely loving God, God himself doesn't even speak about our spirituality without talking about our emotions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's great. So I would then, just final question from these first set of questions, and I think I know your answer, but how would you assess the subtitle of the book, that it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature?
Yeah. So you mentioned that I formerly taught at Reformed Theological Seminary, which let's just say that that's a big tip of the hat of where I fall on like soteriology, right? Like there's not a lot of question of is Nate a Calvinist when I have RTS on my job application and such like that, right? So we'll just own that. And we in those if you're not Reformed, that's totally cool. But for those of us that fall more in the Reformed tradition, we have this interesting stage that everybody goes through called the cage stage Calvinist, right? And what that refers to is an individual who should probably be put into a cage until they mellow out for a while. And I think there's probably a cage stage on just about anything. You can have a cage stage ecclesiologist who maybe gets hopped up about elders and probably just needs to go chill for a while. You can have a cage stage. You are an uber nerd. You probably can have a cage stage about some obscure Hebrew vowel pointing.
I think I'm still there.
Yeah, right.
That's why we have a teacher in prison.
That's right. The real cage.
Right. And right, so what that is, what the K-Stage Calvinist is an individual who has come to understand the Bible's teaching about God's sovereignty over salvation and all things, and feels the need to proselytize that to everybody and views that as being the center point of healthy spirituality. The problem is that what happens there is that there's high intellect, right? There's a really solid understanding of what I would say that the Scripture teaches, but there's not the emotional wisdom behind how to actually integrate that into a whole life, right? And so a person's zeal and intellect causes them to actually be foolish, even though they believe what I would say would be proper doctrine, right? And that can happen in anything. I'd say that that's actually a danger in a community like this one. I mean, I'm a creature built for academics. I fit here. You put me in any other place in the world and I probably struggle, but fit really well in being a nerd and living in academia. And, our communities can oftentimes revolve primarily around the transmission of knowledge, right? You go to Bible classes, you go to theology classes, you go to Greek and Hebrew classes, go to counseling classes. This morning I was talking about person-centered psychotherapy and Rogerian counseling, non-directive counseling, right? I guarantee you most of my students had never thought of that before. Well, now their cup is filled up with all they ever wanted to know about Carl Rogers. Is growth in knowledge. But if there's not a corresponding emotional maturity that's able to engage with self, understand one's own emotions, engage with others, read emotions in others, read our own emotions towards God and such, our intellect can carry us away into a lack of wisdom, even if we're growing in knowledge. And so I would say that that's a really, really great subtitle for a book.
Excellent. Yeah, good. Okay, question number 2 here. As a counselor, how often do you find that people have insufficient self-awareness and self-knowledge? And why is self-knowledge critical for emotional and spiritual growth?
Okay, so I guess as a counselor, the answer is everybody.
Right.
Because none of us are masters of our own hearts. There's just Philippians 3 is a fascinating little passage where Paul says that let's all pursue the call of the upward call in Christ Jesus. That as many of us as are mature think that way, and if in anything you think differently, God will reveal it to you also. But let us hold fast to what we have attained. It's a really interesting passage of the Bible because basically God says there's a lot of things that you don't know, and there's a lot of things that you have not figured out. Live to what you do know, and just know that in the course of your life, I'm going to be revealing things to you progressively over the entire course of your life. And so, Rob, I've forgotten the question now.
How often do you find that people have
yes.
insufficient
That's
self-knowledge? Right. And more importantly, you already answered that really. Why is self-knowledge critical for emotional and spiritual growth?
Yeah. And so the Bible just sets the expectation that all of us are a mystery to ourselves to some degree, right? Like, I don't understand everything that goes on inside of me, and I know that you don't understand everything that goes on inside of you, and I don't always understand why certain emotions are provoked by certain events and certain actions. I don't know why sometimes emotions aren't there when I expect them to be there. All of us have a lack of clarity, of entire clarity of ourselves. And yet we also know that God does reveal us to ourselves progressively. And part of sanctification is growing in our own understanding and ability to map and rightly categorize and rightly respond to our emotions. And I would say also the ability to engage in spaces in an emotionally healthy way where we're respecting others and we don't chain our identity to our beliefs in such a way that it's emotionally crippling when someone disagrees with us and things of that nature.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of continuing on this theme of self-knowledge, let's start with thinking about our own past and processing our own past. I mean, everyone in this room has a very different past. You meet with people all the time, and I'm sure one of the things you constantly find is how people's past affects their present. So this question is, what place then does processing your past have within Christian discipleship? And what are some healthy ways that people can process their past? I recognize that
Yeah.
that depends on the depth of experience and type of experience that people have had, but just let's start talking about the importance of looking back at your life and actually analyzing it for the sake of Christian discipleship.
That's a great question, Rob. So, every you guys have experienced this. Every once in a while, you're reading a book and you run across a line, and you're like, "That's going to change my life." There's actually a couple lines that I've run across, one a while back and one relatively recently on this exact topic, that I think for me has helped kind of provide an understanding of how we think about our past, especially when it comes to emotions. The first was from the Reformed Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck. And I was reading in Bavinck, and he said, a person's philosophy is often nothing more than the history of their heart. A person's philosophy is often nothing more than the history of their heart. And I liked that so much that I went on to Sticker Mule and made a sticker of it, and now have it stuck to my office window.
Yeah.
Because that's what we do when we like quotes, right? A person's philosophy is often nothing more than the history of their heart. In that, when he said philosophy, you could use perhaps the phrase their frame of view, the way they engage the world, how you and I engage the world even now, how we organize information, the emotions that rise or fall within us. Those all are colored by our history, right? So like you mentioned, I meet with a lot of individuals who struggle with just trauma in their past. I had a client once that the pattern of as anxiety would build, as they got deeper and deeper into relationships, they would consistently experience high anxiety and would self-destruct, sabotaging any relationship that they got close in. It's especially difficult because the individual's married now, right, and separated, because you see this pattern of emotional intimacy with someone else is deeply destabilizing for the person. Their anxiety really increases. Well, as we talk through the past, this individual had a significant traumatic family background where intimacy was followed by rejection when it didn't live up to standards, over and over and over again in multiple relationships across about a decade of their life. And really, a lot of what counseling for that individual looks like is helping identify how the emotions of anxiety have almost become like it's a habitualized response to emotional intimacy. Because what tends to run through their mind is, this is all going to end in tears. And so if I can control the way that the tears come, it will be better than if I give my heart to somebody else and they crush it again, right? What's happening there is that the history of that person's heart, their relational traumas, is governing their current philosophy, right? Then the current philosophy is, I must protect myself from intimacy because it will hurt less if I do. Another quotation I read in Karen Swallow Prior's book, On Reading Well, was from William Faulkner. She was quoting William Faulkner, the novelist, and he said, the past is not dead. It is not even the past. Past isn't dead. It's not even the past. Who you and I are is entirely begotten by who you and I were, right? If you look at the things that you deeply care about, that you're passionate about, usually it's one of two things. One is that you were introduced to it and caught a passion from it by someone else. Or two, you had the opposite happen to you, and now you don't want to ever commit yourself to the thing that harmed you, right? Is that the emotions that rise and fall within us are narratively driven by the things that have happened in our pasts usually. So when we think about kind of processing, working through the past, one of the things that I do with my counselees and from the beginning is trying to help them map and understand what from your history do you tend to react to emotionally in the present, right? Understanding that we tend to habitualize our emotions to particular kind of stimuli based off of what's happened in the past there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. This question is not pre-written, but I have to ask you because it's always on my mind when I talk to
Rob
counselors.
goes off script. Brace yourselves.
Yeah.
We should have seatbelts here.
Well, and this is actually a really huge rabbit trail. So don't go as far off the path as you'd like. But as you help people, as you counsel people, as you assess people's spiritual journey, how do you think through nature versus nurture? I know that's like a massive kind of question, but I actually think the more I've thought about it in my own experience, the more. So just a little background. I'm from a tradition, a theological and I would say church tradition that really emphasize nature. That how we act and what we do is
right there.
very much a product of our in particular our sin nature.
Yeah.
As I've lived my life, especially in the Christian community, I have a desire to balance that out, I think, better with nurture and how the environment in which people are raised. So how do you as a counselor, in your experience with people, blend those two things together? What does that look like in your thinking?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you something from just kind of my own life. So my wife and I were both raised in conservative Christian families. We both heard the gospel probably first from our parents. And really we have kind of similar backgrounds on the whole. We actually went to high school together. And one thing that we noticed soon after getting married is that my wife and I have very different approaches towards people that we have just met. My wife tends to be more suspicious of others. And I used to say that I tend to be more trusting than others, but that's loading the dice against her because trust is a virtue and suspicion is a vice. I think it's more proper to say that I tend to be more naive towards others, which is really goofy when you consider the type of counseling that I do, of abuse and trauma counseling, but somehow that still hasn't, I have not emotionally integrated my healthy spirituality in that category. Right, so we learned pretty quickly that my wife tends to have a little bit of a prove-it mentality. And I tend to have a naive, oh yeah, everything's great mentality. And you know, the more we kind of dialogued about this, you know, her point was like, you're gonna get our kids hurt. And I was like, you're gonna hold yourself back from any relationships. The more we dialogued about this, the more we began to discover that her parents divorced when she was 12, and her dad went to prison. He was a leader in the church and no one knew. Does that have an impact on how you view other people? I, on the other hand, came from a family that was, at least growing up, really harmonious. And there weren't a lot of speed bumps in the road. And so it's interesting, my wife and I come from pretty similar nature standpoints, right? Both, like our Enneagram scores are the same, if you're into that kind of thing. We grew up in the same kind of theological, spiritual environments, went to the same high school, grew up in the same kind of environment. But you have this different event that happened for her versus me. And it's not that rewrote our love for the Lord. It's not that it rewrote anything about us spiritually. But what it did is it kind of rewrote some of the lenses through which we view other people in really natural and normal ways. I think one of God's greatest gifts to us was each other, and that we actually help moderate each other in that regard. You know, so when we start thinking about nature versus nurture, I come from more of a kind of a hardcore Reformed tradition. And one of the mistakes I think that my tradition tends to make is that it spiritualizes everything and that emotions get collapsed into a subcategory of spirituality. That's actually not how things work, right? You have a wide variety of temperaments. You have a wide variety of personalities. You have a wide variety of emotional expressions. Even look inside the Bible, right? Peter is a different person than some of those other apostles, right? John gets nicknamed the son of thunder, right? He has an emotional. He's a emotionally reactive individual. That's very different than perhaps your more cerebral Paul or things like that. Is that the way in which we emotionally interpret life, it's not just about spirituality. There's also a nurturing that happens that shapes our emotional engagement. So you may have grown up in a family in which like emotional expression was not really permitted. Crying was unacceptable, right? Real men don't cry. Real women aren't hysterical. And what I mean by that is, showing emotions, things like that. That may have been what you were taught, and that may have very well shaped the way that you emotionally engage with the world. That's a nurture aspect, right? So that has a huge impact on how you even engage with relationships now. So it's not, but at the same time, we are human beings who are made in God's image, that are emotional creatures that do have inherent personalities that are different than others. And so I'd say it's always a combination of nature and nurture. Different theological traditions tend to overemphasize one or another. Mine tends to underemphasize nurture by collapsing more everything into nature, sin nature, regenerate nature. Perhaps other stripes tend to forget as much about nature, sin nature, redemptive nature, and tend to overemphasize the emotional aspects, the nurture aspects when it comes to our emotions.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for going pretty far down the rabbit trail.
Yeah,
That's pretty good. I appreciate that.
I used to raise rabbits. So I'm really good at
Okay. Great. All right. Want to continue to think about what emotionally healthy spirituality is. So let's pivot now to talking about limits for a little while. In the book, Scazzaro argues that emotionally healthy spirituality involves surrendering to your limits as a human being. So what would you say about this topic? What place does recognizing one's limits have in the process of Christian discipleship and growth?
Yeah. There's quite a few verses tucked away that we don't tend to like. Things like the Bible describes us as clay pots. And I don't know about you, I don't find that to be a particularly flattering definition. Clay pots stain pretty easy. Clay pots break if you touch them wrong. Clay pots are easily smashed by children. Right? There's a reason everything in my house is plastic of value, right? Like our limitations as human beings are part of who we are. And I think we're all pretty willing to acknowledge that in some categories. And we also tend to be pretty hesitant to acknowledge that in other categories. Like, guys, I'm a 5'7" white guy with no hops. Like, there was just a whole arena known as athletics that wasn't ever going to be my jam. That's why I run. Like, my sport is every other sport's punishment. Because I can, endure discomfort, but don't ask me to shoot a basketball. I think I'm the only person in my school's history to have a 0.000 batting average in varsity baseball and a .000 field goal percentage in basketball. I think I'm the only person in my school's history to have zeros across two sports. And when it came to football, I was the statistician because 5'7" white guy. Right? I think we're pretty adept at acknowledging our physical limitations. Right? I think we're more hesitant to acknowledge our, I don't want to say spiritual limitations, I'll just describe it as our inner person limitations, right? Like, one of the things that I've had to come to terms with in counseling is that there are certain types of people that I'm just not very good at counseling. Individuals from a military background, I really struggle with. I really struggle with counseling them because I really struggle with wrapping my mind around how they process the world. I do a lot of trauma abuse counseling. A lot of that is heavily narrative driven. And that means that I'm not very directive as a counselor. And I don't necessarily have the range as a counselor to be very good at meeting with an individual who has 20 years invested in tell me what to do, right? The military is all around orders. It doesn't matter whether you like the orders or not, you do what you're told. And so for me as a counselor, I really struggle stepping into those spaces because I get really anxious telling people what to do. I want to lead them. I want to guide them. I want to help them that way. The military is also not super adept at caring for people's emotional health, right? And that's something that and so that muscle tends to be really underdeveloped for individuals. And I'm so thankful for those that spend their life providing the freedoms that we're able to even do things like this. I'm so grateful for it, but I also recognize that I myself am limited as a human being, and that's just the kind of individual that I really struggle to minister well with. And I've learned to refer them to individuals that's more their lane, right? I think all of us can struggle in various things that way. And when we don't know our limitations in ministry, that's when we tend to hurt people. When we don't know our limitations in relationships, we tend to hurt people. Right? So even in my relationships, my relationship with my wife, there are certain things that I'm really good at doing in caring for her well. And there's other ways that I stare at it and I'm like, I wish I was a lot better at that. Like, I just recognize that I'm underdeveloped in these ways. And it may be that I stay relatively underdeveloped because that's just something that I'm not naturally good and gifted at. And when we think, everyone here is planning on being some kind of leader. In a lot of ways, being a good leader, it's about recognizing your strengths, sure, but it's also about recognizing your weaknesses. Because when we start ministering into our weaknesses and don't recognize them as our weaknesses, that's where we're headed towards hurting other people. And if our job is to be shepherds or individuals who care, I want to make sure that I'm at a place that I actually have the range and gifting and maturity to be able to help somebody. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I actually love that you used a personal example because as someone who is very actively engaged in ministry, you just gave all of us an example of displaying, hey, here's a weakness in my ministry that I recognize. Yeah. Here's how I deal with it. Follow suit. I think people there can be a tendency in ministers to think that they can do it all, right? Yeah. And there's various reasons for that they may put on themselves, that others may put upon them. But I think you've just displayed, and I think it's really helpful how you've displayed that that's not the case. In ministry, recognize your limits.
Yeah, I was a business major in college, and one of my favorite professors was R.W. Mackey III, who I know none of you have ever heard of. And he was just a wise individual. And I remember taking a human resources class from him, and he said, so often the advice we get is to identify your strengths and then work on your weaknesses so that they are not your weaknesses anymore. And he said, I think that's actually backwards advice. Because if you spend all of your time focusing on trying to make your weaknesses not your weaknesses, you're going to actually spend your time ignoring developing your strengths into being really, really strong. Mm-hmm. He said, instead, I think the best thing to do is to be able to map your weaknesses and work on them to the degree that they aren't crippling to you. And then pursue the things that you're really gifted at. And then hire people whose strengths are your weaknesses and don't be threatened by them. And give them the freedom to do what you're really not as good at.
Yeah.
And I think I've loved that advice, and that's stuck with me for starting to push 2 decades now, because what it did for me is it freed me from feeling like I had to be, right? When Paul says that he's all things to all people, that's talking about his ability to talk to people. It's not talking about absolute extreme excellence in every category of ministry, right? It's talking about not being offensive to individuals in the cultural realm. I should develop myself to the point that I'm able to talk with those who maybe are, to continue the illustration, come from more of the directive military background. If I can't say anything to them, I'm doing it wrong. But I don't feel the need to devote my time and energy to becoming a really good counselor for those that are more directive in terms of personality. Because that's just not my natural lane. I want to devote my time and energy to becoming the best kind of trauma and abuse, narrative-oriented counselor that I possibly can, redemptive-oriented counselor that I can, because that's what makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So I think, friends, that's something that we can feel a freedom in, is that it's not our responsibility to become equally well-rounded in everything. We can't. We're very limited that way. And part of emotional maturity is to be really, really okay with saying, I'm not good at that, but man, I've got this friend over here who is, and they can bless you a lot more than I can.
Yeah, it just reminds me of Paul saying there's many gifts in the body. Recognize yours, recognize others, and operate accordingly.
Yeah.
All right, let's do 2 more questions, and then we'll open up the floor to everyone here. First, what are just some specific practical steps that we as individuals can take here to cultivate emotionally healthy spirituality in our lives?
Yeah, so what practical steps can we take to cultivate basically emotionally healthy spirituality? I'd say one of the first things is to be curious about yourself. We don't live in a particularly self-reflective culture. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I mean, on my way from the classroom in the chapel over here, I'm actually looking at my phone, looking at an email, right? Like, we fill our spaces with stuff. Physical. We fill our, I showed a movie clip in class today from A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. That's the Tom Hanks, Mr. Rogers movie. And there's a scene in it where there's 1 minute of silence. And after about 30 seconds, I start to get a little uncomfortable. And I look at my students, and they're all kind of squirming in their seat a little bit. And guys, it's only 60 seconds. Like, we can't handle 60 seconds of introspection. And what that does is it allows us to avoid actually taking stock of what's going on inside of our hearts a lot of times. And so I think a first step is to actually take a look inside and be curious about what's going on inside of us. What are my emotions when X happens? What do my emotions tend to be around this? What do I think about them? Do I think that they are good and righteous emotions? Do I think they reflect God's heart? Are they natural emotions? What are ways that those emotions help me? What are ways that those emotions hinder me? I think we talk a lot about holding fast to strong doctrine, which is good. We're a theological institution that's confessional in nature. We also, though, need to spend time thinking about how we ourselves are engaging with ourselves, right? We don't spend a lot of time thinking about our emotions. And honestly, just kind of working on building an emotional map of who am I as I engage with the world around me. What's happening inside of me? That's a first step. I think another step is working to build emotionally healthy relationships with others, right? Identifying friends that are good sounding boards for, hey, I'm noticing this about myself. Do you notice that too? What are some ways that you see that this is a benefit in my relationships? What are some ways that this is a negative in my relationships, right? I'd say that different kind of vibes rise and fall inside of culture and then the church. And maybe we live in an age that's quicker to dispense with relationships, and perhaps older time frames endured in relationships longer. There's positives and negatives to both. But what I see sometimes in people is oftentimes there's a pattern of like broken relationships. We don't usually spend time thinking about kind of how our emotions towards even those relationships influence future relationships. Having friends to help identify patterns in how we tend to engage with others is really helpful.
Yeah.
As well. I think those are two things that I start with.
I think those are really powerful. I mean, perhaps the most influential takeaway from that book and others like it was just this emphasis on introspection and contemplation and being quiet and getting rid of the phone and the TV and the laptop and just actually trying to be silent. It is amazing if you take that seriously how hard it can be. If you're living in the world that we live in, to actually find time for introspection, self-reflection is pretty challenging because of how we're trained to live our lives in the modern world. So that I think those two steps are actually really helpful. So final question that I have for you then is now, how can pastors, ministry leaders, especially create emotionally healthy cultures in the ministries that they lead? You already alluded to this briefly by recognizing your weaknesses and including, hiring people who have different those strengths. Who are your weaknesses or their strengths. Can you talk a little bit more about like an emotionally healthy kind of culture in the church in particular, and maybe other ministry contexts? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is always going to be leading by example, right? Well, first by being, and then second by leading by example. It's interesting. At my church on Sunday, I go to Faith Youngsville, and Dr. Wade, who also teaches here, was preaching, and it was a passage. We're going through Acts right now, and it was a passage on persecution, where Paul and Silas are beaten and then thrown in the stocks. This is where the church at Philippi begins. There's the earthquake, stocks come off, jailer's about to kill himself. Paul says, wait, we're still here, right? You guys know that passage. And it was really interesting. I so appreciated what Stephen did in his sermon. As he said, friends, we're not here. We're not here as a culture right now. I just have to acknowledge that. Many places around the world are here, but we're not. We're not going to be beaten and thrown in a stockade. And then he said, if I'm really honest, this passage troubles me. And it troubles me because I really want to think that if I were in this environment, that I would do what Paul and Silas did. That I would be singing hymns, and that when the opportunity to escape opened up itself, that I would care more about the salvation or the survival and salvation of the jailer than about my freedom. And then he said, but I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't know if I would be that. I hope I would be. I pray I would be. I pray that God would build me to be that kind of person. But if I'm honest, I don't know. And that floored me, guys, because he's up in front. So there's about a couple thousand people at our church. A pastor acknowledging that he's not sure if he would endure persecution in front of 2,000 people. That's really rare. Mm-hmm. And yet what that just did is that gave permission for everybody else in the room to acknowledge their own similar fears. It's actually probably the people who have no fear in that situation that we should probably be most concerned about, right? Or that say, I would be totally fine with that. Maybe. But what that did is that opened us up as a congregation to acknowledge we don't have to have this all together. The church we were at before, a pastor named Jonathan Holmesley, who's a grad here, talked from the pulpit about his and his wife's struggles with grief after a miscarriage that they had. It's the only time I've ever heard miscarriage mentioned from a pulpit. Actually, in my classes, I'll have people raise their hand and ask, how many of you ever heard miscarriage mentioned from the pulpit? And usually it's me and one other person. but about 33% of couples in our churches have experienced miscarriages. And to hear Jonathan talk about grief that wouldn't go away, grief that wasn't simply counteracted by rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice and all the rest. What that did is that gave our church the permission to struggle and to say, my emotions aren't mapping how I want them to. It gave them permission to understand grief as being actually a godly emotion. And so I think that, as we engage as leaders, we set the tone. And by not trying to present ourselves as being emotionally bulletproof, as being people who are happy to talk about our struggles, our limitations, our weaknesses, the boundaries of what we're good at and not good at, that really does transform the culture of a community from one that has to be kind of the shiny, happy people to individuals who are like, hey, we are humans. And that means that we live in a world that is buffeted by a universe that is actively fighting against us. And people that are broken and rub their brokennesses off on us and ourselves are not inherently trustworthy. Like I know that my emotions aren't inherently trustworthy. They're sometimes right and sometimes wrong. And what that means is that you're going to have a collection of battered individuals on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights or whatever. And the more that we can normalize human struggle, the deeper our ability to help people have a emotionally integrated spirituality that says that doctrine doesn't eliminate pain. Doctrine doesn't eliminate sorrow. Doctrine doesn't create this tranquility. So where it says, be anxious for nothing, ... and the peace of God which surpasses all understanding will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. That's not just talking about having totally still waters. That's talking about the peace of God that we've been reconciled with God. It redefines our anxiety, but it doesn't all of a sudden get rid of all the feelings. To where we have a community that is not afraid to talk about the stuff that's going on inside of us. Yeah. We don't have to present doctrinally shiny facades.
That's great.